As we begin this morning in the book of Job, we're going to be talking about some introductory material in the first two chapters, what is known as the Prologue, the outlines for chapter 3 through 7, as well as some questions on that section for next week or in the back. So we begin to look at the book of Job. One of the first things I think that's important for us to understand is the fact that this is a real story. In other words, the events of the book of Job are historical. There are some that have taken a look at the book of Job and have thought that it's just a made-up story, that there really wasn't a Job that lived and that the struggles are sort of exaggerated. But there is no doubt, I don't believe, to the serious Bible student, that Job is a real character who really lived and who really died and who really faced the kind of problems that are going to be described in chapters 1 and 2. Why would I think that the book is historical? Well, he's referenced as a real character. He's referenced once in the New Testament. James chapter 5 and in verse 11, James said, "Indeed, you've heard of the perseverance of Job," or the patience or the steadfastness of Job. And he treats him as being just as real as the prophets that are also used as an example of endurance. In fact, if it's a made-up story, there's really not an example at all. I mean, when we think about the patience of Job, if he's not real, if he really didn't face these things, then how can he really serve as an example for you and for me? Not only does James treat him as a real character, he's referenced one other time outside the book of Job. There are only two references to him outside the book, one in the New Testament, James 5:11, the other's in the book of Ezekiel. In Ezekiel chapter 14, Ezekiel is making the point that there's not enough of a righteous influence left in the land that is going to cause God to preserve it. And he uses three examples of righteousness. And what he says in Ezekiel chapter 14 is, though these three men, Noah and Daniel and Job, were in it, they would deliver only themselves by their righteousness, says the Lord. And then he mentions those three characters again down in verse 20. And so Job is mentioned as a righteous man and just as real as Noah and the contemporary Daniel there. So he's referenced as a real character. The book of Job is quoted only once in the New Testament, and that is found in 1 Corinthians chapter 3 and in verse 19. It is a quotation from Job 5 and in verse 13, where in that speech by Job, Job had made the point that he catches the wise in their own craftiness. Just a very short quote, and that is the only time in the New Testament that the book of Job is quoted. But the events are historical. They really happened. He's a real man that really lived and really faced these struggles, and he really overcame them. When we look at the book of Job, it falls into the category of wisdom literature or poetry. When you see the divisions of the Old Testament divided up, we've got the books of law, you've got books of history, and then there's about 5 books right there in the middle that we either identify as wisdom literature or as poetic literature. When we call them wisdom literature, what does that mean? What kind of genre is that? What do the books of wisdom deal with? They deal with life. The books of wisdom, Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Song of Solomon. When we finish Job, we're going to go to Ecclesiastes and then the Song of Solomon. But these are books that really deal with practical daily living. They're not really so much books of law as they are books that deal with how we live our lives day to day. For example, much of what is said in the book of Proverbs is as applicable to you and I today as it was when it was written, because it deals with how we control the tongue. It deals with the controlling of our anger. The book of Ecclesiastes, even though we don't live under the same law that Solomon lived under, the message that if happiness is going to be found, it's found in fearing God, keeping His commandments, is as pertinent to you and I as it was when Solomon first wrote it. They deal with practical daily living. And the book of Job deals with the issue of dealing with suffering and how we view that and how we're able to overcome it. So it's practical daily living is what the books of wisdom literature are about. In addition to the books of literature, it's also considered poetry. In fact, the middle section of the book of Job is poetic. 1/3 of the Old Testament is written in poetic form. In fact, if you're using a translation, probably almost any translation outside of the King James translation. The King James translation, most of them that I'm aware of, don't use poetic format. But most of them, if you're flipping through, you'll see a change in the format. For example, in Psalms, in Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and beginning in Job 3, really continuing through Job 42 in verses 7 through verse 17, you're going to have this in poetic form. The first 2 chapters are narrative. That's story. And after that, it is poetic form. In fact, the book of Job, just from its pure literary value, is considered one of the greatest poems ever written. Now, it's Hebrew poetry. And that means that when you and I look at it, it doesn't fit with what we think of when we think about poetry. There's not the rhythm, there's not the rhyme that sometimes you and I would think of, either with regard to poetry. But it's more poetic in thought, particularly you see that in the book of Psalms. And so it's not like Western poetry. But we are dealing with poetic language. What that means, by the way, when we get into the speeches of Job and Eliphaz and Bildad and Zophar, later Elihu, and even God, those are not verbatim recordings of what they said. It is recorded for us in poetic form. And so keep that in mind. What is the message of the book of Job? What are we to get out of this book? Well, first of all, let me just say that there's no doubt that it deals with the problem of human suffering. It's not uncommon to hear somebody say, well, the book of Job is about why the righteous suffer. I remember the very first book I ever taught when I started full-time preaching. I remember pulling into Alabama. I was 19 years old. And I said, okay, what are we studying on Wednesday night? And they said, we want you to teach the book of Job. And I knew who Job was. I obviously had heard of the perseverance of Job, the patience of Job. I don't know that I had ever studied from the book of Job from beginning to end. And, you get in there and you think, okay, the book is going to answer the question of why the righteous suffer. And you're sort of disappointed in the end that what? There's not really an answer given to that. Not all the problems are resolved, but it deals with the reality of human suffering. It deals with trusting God in the midst of that suffering. In some ways, what Job emphasizes is God's greatness and knowledge in comparison to man's limitations. And what I mean by that is Job never has an answer to the question of suffering when the book of Job ends. Now, you and I have one. We know why Job suffered, but Job doesn't know why Job suffered. And I think that illustrates the inability of man and the limitations of man to understand all that God is doing or understand why everything takes place the way that it does. God doesn't explain the reason of the suffering of Job. I've always found it interesting that even when God finally says, okay, Job, let me talk to you. Let me address. You've been wanting an audience with me. I'm going to talk to you. That at no point in time does God say to Job, let me just explain why all this happened. Satan came into my midst. Satan challenged me. He threw down the gauntlet. I could not let that go unchallenged. He never tells Job any of that. He doesn't explain the cause of suffering to Job. And oftentimes you and I, like Job, are left without, in some ways, a satisfactory answer to us as to why this took place or that took place. And that's why faith comes in the book of Job. One of my favorite quotations of on the book of Job is Alfred Edersheim, in commenting on the book, and he says, we cannot understand the meaning of many trials. God does not explain them. To explain them would be to destroy its object, which is that of calling for simple faith and implicit obedience. If we knew why the Lord sent us this or that trial, it would thereby cease to be a trial either of faith or of patience. In other words, if we knew everything as to the reason why and we could look forward, we could see the end result of everything, it wouldn't be much of a trial. And part of the trial is not in the understanding of why. J. Siddle Baxter said, the fact is, Job was not meant to know the explanation of his trial. And on this simple fact, everything hangs. If Job had known, there would have been no place for faith. And the man could never have come forth as gold purified in the fire. We are meant to understand that there are some things which God cannot reveal to us at present, inasmuch as the very revealing of them would thwart his purpose for our good. The Scriptures are as wise in their reservations as in their revelations. Enough is revealed to make faith intelligent. Enough is reserved to give faith scope for development. In this we repeat lies the message of the book, that there was an explanation, but that Job did not know it and was not meant to know it. And so when we look at the book of Job and we think about its theme, part of the message is it deals with the problem of human suffering, but it also deals with man's limitations and understanding the why and the reason behind all suffering. David Dan said throughout God's speeches, his ability to create the world and to organize, direct, and sustain its operation is contrasted with man's inability to even begin to understand how such things could be accomplished. I should have put this on the thing. The book of Job is in many ways a defense of God's perfection. It is a defense of the fact that God is worthy to be praised because he is God. And that's the challenge. I'll deal with that when we get to chapter 1 in just a minute. But keep this in mind. God is not on trial in the book of Job. I think sometimes we look in the times of suffering and we put God on trial. Where's God? Why is this happening? The question is not God in the book of Job. Who's on trial in the book of Job? It's Job. How is he going to respond? What is he going to do? And in the times of our trial, God is not on trial. But the question is, how are we going to respond? What are we going to do in those times? And so it's a book dealing with the suffering of man, man's limitations to understand it, and God's perfection and being worthy to be worshipped. The time of the book of Job. When you deal with the time of Job, we're talking about when did Job live? When did the story take? There are two questions about timing in Job. One is, when did the story take place? The second one is, when was the book of Job written? And those are two differing questions. The book of Job seemingly takes place during the time of the patriarchal days. Now, we don't know for sure. I can't tell you a date like I could in Micah and say, write this down in the margin of your Bible. But it does seem that this takes place during the patriarchal days. Why would we say that? There are a number of evidences, one of which would be that he served as a priest for his family. Job, by the way, is not an Israelite name. It's a Gentile name. So it does seem that he may not have been an Israelite. Maybe the nation had not even begun at that point in time. If we place him back sometime around the time of Abraham, his age seems to indicate that this is the patriarchal period. In chapter 42 and verse 16, how long does Job live after all of this trial? Anybody remember? It says there, chapter 42, he lived 140 years. So if Job lived 140 years after all of this, how long did he live before it? I don't know, but he had 10 grown children. So if we put, for example, if we put at a minimum, let's just say that he's 50 years old at a minimum, that means by the time the book closes, he's what? He's 190 years old. When does that age range fit? It fits in the days of the patriarchs, doesn't it? Because later on, man lived a much shorter life than that. You also see there's no reference to the law of Moses. There's no reference to the tabernacle. There's no reference to anything in the law that likely would have been recorded had the story taken place after the law of Moses had been given. There's some other evidences as well. The money that is referred to in the book of Job is a word that only occurs in the patriarchal period, in the book of Genesis, and then in the book of Joshua, referring back to the buying of the grave during the days of the patriarch. And so the reality is this is a very early on. That's why sometimes when we say, I like to study the Bible in chronological order. Have you ever done a chronological Bible reading where you read the Bible in the order that the events took place? Chances are, if you've got a chronological Bible or a chronological reading, you're reading along somewhere around Genesis chapter 12, and all of a sudden you go to the book of Job. And the reason for that is that's about the time frame Job would have lived his life. It would have taken place very early on in the Bible in the Bible story. When was it written? We don't know. Some think Moses wrote it. Some think it was written at some other period of time. It does seem that it was written by the time of Ezekiel, because by the time Ezekiel's written, all of the captives knew who Job was. Remember, he mentioned Noah and Noah and Daniel and Job. So by the time of captivity, it seems that it would have been completed and they would have been very familiar with him. Who wrote the book? We don't know. Job seemingly can be ruled out as the author for the following reasons. He refers to himself as the third person all the time through the book. That doesn't mean conclusively that he's not the author, but that makes it highly unlikely. Job did this, Job did that, as opposed to what? Me, yes.
Can you estimate the time frame this was? I know you said patriarch.
Probably sometime around the time Abraham would have lived is generally what people would have thought. So I'd have to look back and see exactly the years of Abraham lived. And so, let's see, 14, that would have been, the captivity takes, the exit from Egypt is 1440 BC. They were in captivity from the time the promise was given to Abraham. They were going to go in captivity for what, 400 years. So you're probably talking somewhere between 800 to 1,000 BC, I think would probably be let me work the other way. I'm working in the wrong direction. We'd be 1600, about 1600 BC would be about the period of time then that we would be between 18 and 1600. But I wouldn't feel comfortable giving an exact date for the book of Job, just in that general time period. And so many different suggestions have been given. You've got the quotations there. I'm not going to go over those right now. Hezekiah, Baruch. The fact is, at the end of the day, Roy Gingrich says we just don't know. We don't know who wrote the book. But that it was inspired, I know, because it's referred to in the book of James chapter 5 and verse 11. And that's really all that matters. It takes place in the land of Uz. Here's the great thing about the book of Job. You can answer a lot of questions right, whether you know it or not. Who wrote the book? And you say, I don't know. And I say, when was it written? And you say, I don't know. Where's the land of Uz? You say, I don't know. And the answer is correct on all of those. I mean, we just don't know. We don't know exactly. What we do know about the land of Uz is that it was in the east. It was located near a desert or a wilderness, and probably somewhere between Edom and the Arabian deserts. It mentions here all of these people that are surrounding it, the Temites, the Shuites, the Naamites, the Buzzites, the Chaldeans were close. And so it's somewhere in the area of the Arabian desert, but it was close enough that livestock was provided for, and Job was a very prosperous man. But at the end of the day, anytime you see it given, it's a region south of Palestine, and Edom and northwest Arabia have been proposed. And so it takes place in the land of Uz. And here is your book. Here's all you got to remember about your outline before we get into the story. And that's the interesting part. The book of Job divides itself into three sections. You've got the prologue, 1 to 2. Almost every outline you see is going to be almost identical to this in some way. You've got the prologue. That's the setting of the stage for what's going to take place. You've got the dialogue. That is the poetic section. That is the conversations between Job and his three friends, and then Elihu, and then ultimately God and Job. And then you've got the epilogue, which is the outcome at the end that tells us when Job is blessed again. So that's a pretty simple way to remember the book of Job. Here's one by Wayne Jackson that I didn't put in your material, but he bakes it down a little bit further. Job is tested, 1 and 2. Job's controversy with his friends, 3 to 31. Elihu's presentation, 32 to 37. Jehovah speaks, 38 to 41. And then Job is blessed, verse 42. So however you want to remember it, but as I say, that first one is going to be the one that most people are going to use to divide up the content of Job. So let's get into chapter 1 and chapter 2. All that's interesting and maybe important for us to appreciate some of the background, but the interesting part is in the text, obviously, itself. As you begin here in chapter 1, the chapter really begins by describing Job. I think it's McGuigan that says this is life in the sunshine. in the first part. Life is going well for Job. In fact, it's hard to imagine that life could be any better for Job than what it is in the first five verses of this book. Job is introduced to us as a man in the land of Uz. And what was his character like? He's blameless, he's upright, one who feared God and shunned evil. And by the way, that's the conundrum, isn't it, in the book? If Job is introduced and he's a wicked man, if he's an ungodly man, we don't have any problem at all with the suffering that is going to follow. The problem is he is an exceptional character. He's blameless. That doesn't mean he was sinless. In fact, Job mentions his sin. Job 7 and verse 20 and other places he mentions his sins before God. Job does not claim perfection in the book of Job. Job is not saying, I've never done anything wrong. Somebody said blameless describes his character and upright describes his actions. I don't know if that's true or not, but he treats people right. He lives a righteous life, and he does that because he fears God. He respects God. He wants to serve the Lord, and as a result of that, he shuns evil. I like the translation, he turns away from evil. That may even suggest that Job is not sinless, but when he makes a mistake, you know what he does? He turns away from it. He repents. He makes things right. And so Job is a person of exceptional character. Not only is Job a spiritual giant, how are things going for Job on the financial front? He's wealthy. In fact, in describing Job, it said in verse 2, he had 7 sons and 3 daughters that were born to him. Psalm 127, the man that has his quiver full of children is what? He's blessed by God. Some make a lot out of the fact that 7 and 3 equals 10. 10 was the number for perfection. 7 was also a complete number. He had more than twice as many boys as he did girls, and that was considered a sign of divine favor. All of that may be true, but on the family front, Job has been what? Abundantly blessed. Let me suggest something else before I talk about his financial situation. In verse 4, seems to suggest to me that this is a close family. His sons and his daughters, what do? They get together, each on his day. I don't know what that means. Some think it's a reference to the birthday, that they got together on each one's birthday. They base that on Job 3:1. Others think that the meaning is that every brother had a day, and on Monday you went to the oldest brother, and Tuesday you went to the other one, and if that's the case, that means that they were extremely close as they found time to be with one another. And that also sets the stage for the tragedy, by the way, that's going to happen later on in the book of Job. But life is what? He's on the mountaintop. I mean, he's living a godly life. He's living an upright life. He's got an abundant, a family that is close, that no doubt he loves and he cares for. And in the area of business, what does he have? He's got 7,000 sheep and 3,000 camels. If you add that up, by the way, that's 10,000. There's the number 10 again. And then you got 500 yoke of oxen and 500 female donkeys. If you add that up again, you come back with the same multiple of 10 for perfection. But the point is, he had all that he needed, what? And more, and a great household. And that great household there is a reference to our very large household in verse 3, probably to all the servants he had. You may remember that Abraham, when Lot was taken captive, he was able to get 300 men just from among his servants in order to go and to help rescue him. I picture Job as sort of being along that same line. And yet, in spite of all his prosperity, he's still what? A worshiper of God. He's humble. Certainly wealth can be a barrier to serving God, but when you look in verses 4 and verse 5, he's a worshiper of God. He's offering sacrifices. He's a spiritual leader in his family. He even offers sacrifices for his children, what? Just in case they curse God. By the way, that word curse, you probably have a footnote that may say it means bless, but in a negative sense. In other words, sometimes words meant the opposite of what they were used. It was a greeting used. I like what Wayne Jackson says, when in essence, the word carries with the idea of saying goodbye. And the point is, for example, later, it occurs 2 other times in the first 2 chapters. In Job 1:11, Satan tells God that if you take away the blessings, Job will curse you to your face. The idea is Job is going to say, so long, God, goodbye. I am what? I'm done with you. And later on in chapter 2, I think it's verse 9, but you have to verify me on that. Job's wife says, why don't you curse God and die? Which in essence is say, why don't you just be done with the Lord? If you've served him, you've tried to serve him, and this is what's happened, why don't you just be done with the Lord and just die? Maybe even implying take your life, but we'll get to that in a moment. And so when he says, just in case, in some way they have neglected God or said goodbye, I want to offer a sacrifice for them. It would be much like, I don't know that they did anything wrong. It would be much like us praying for our children when they're away from us. That, Lord, please keep them. If they've done anything, let it be brought to their attention. Let them make things right. I think that's what Job is doing in Job 1 through 5. And so you could sort of see in verses 1 through verse 5, if you had to describe Job's life, you would say what? It's about as good as it gets. Life is going well. But then in 6 through 12, we have the first assembly of God and Satan that occurs in the book of Job. And the day came when the sons of God, that's angels, the Septuagint uses the word angels there, to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan came also among them. Apparently there was a regular gathering of these angelic beings with the Lord. I don't know why, whether it was to give a report, get instruction, the Bible doesn't tell us. But they came before the Lord, and in the midst of them Satan came in. And when Satan comes in, the Lord asks him a question. What does the Lord ask him?
From where do you come?
From where do you come? The Lord is not trying to elicit information from the standpoint that God doesn't know, but sometimes God asks questions to get our response back for us to contemplate. And here it's asked for our benefit. Where had Satan been? Going to and fro and walking back and forth on the earth. I have in my Bible here out beside it, 1 Peter 5 and verse 8. Be sober, be vigilant, for your adversary the devil what? Walks about as a roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour. What was he doing? I can only assume he's doing what he always does, right? Looking for somebody to devour, looking for somebody to lead astray. And then the Lord said to him what? Have you considered my servant Job? By the way, when we deal with the problem of suffering, Satan is an inadequate answer. And the reason Satan is an inadequate answer in the book of Job is because two things. Number one, Satan never occurs after chapter 2. Do you know that? He mentioned in chapter 2, but when we get into the rest of the book, Satan never occurs again. Number two, Satan can only operate within the limits that what? That God allowed. And number three, it is God, not Satan, that brings up Job. Satan doesn't walk in and bring up Job, but God brings up Job to Satan and says what? Have you considered my servant Job? By the way, think about what all that entails. Moses, my servant. What a compliment. He's one of mine. Have you considered him? And then God uses exactly the language that is found in verse 1 to describe Job. There's none like him on the earth. He's blameless and upright, and one who fears God and who shuns evil. What's the response by Satan? Does Job fear God for nothing? What's the implication?
He's doing it because you take care of it.
Do what? He had a hedge around. The only reason Job is serving you is what? You have bribed him into serving you. You have bribed him to where he's serving you. And the implication of that is, by the way, God, you don't deserve what? Service and worship apart from having bribed man to do it. By yourself, you are not worthy of worship and you are not worthy to be served. And so he said, you put this hedge around him, you're protecting him, you bless the work of his hand. But if you took all of that away, he'd say bye to you, he'd curse you and to your face in verse 11. And so the implication again is, unless you're bribing man and giving him blessings, man's not going to serve you, and you're not worthy to be served apart from that. And so God takes up the challenge, if you will, from Satan, and what does he allow? Or verse 11, by the way, Satan says, you stretch out your hand, touch all that he has, and he'll surely curse you to the face. And the Lord said what? I'm not going to stretch, in essence, God, I'm not going to stretch out my hand and curse him, but what? I will let you curse him. I will let you take things away from him, but I'm going to put one condition on that right now. What is that? Don't touch his person. And by the way, I've got written in the margin of my Bible, I think this is an important lesson that we learn in the book of Job. Satan only operates in the limits God allows. Okay. When God says, for example, that he'll not allow me to be tempted beyond what I'm able, can he put that limit on Satan? He absolutely can. And he does that twice here in chapter 1 and 2. So, in 13 through 22, we have this first trial. And there was a day when all the sons and the daughters were eating together and drinking wine in the oldest brother's house. And while they're there, a messenger comes to Job and says, the oxen were plowing and the donkeys feeding beside them. The Sabaeans raided and took them away, and indeed they've killed the servants with the edge of the sword, and I alone am left. And so just like that, 500 oxen and 500 female donkeys, they're what? They're gone. And not only that, the servants that were taking care of them, they've all been killed, and I alone am left. And that sort of would have been a devastating news for Job. Now, I want you to highlight this in your Bible because it occurs 3 times in verse 16. While he was still speaking. You can highlight in 16 and 17 and 18. While he's still speaking. You know, have you ever had a time where you look back and you say, man, this has been a challenging year? There's probably been times where you and I have done that. We've looked back and we've thought, man, maybe there was a loss of a loved one. There was a change in jobs. And we think, man, this has been a difficult year. But I doubt any of us have ever had a year like Job had, much less what? A day. And not just a day. All this happened, if you can imagine, the word coming back to Job within maybe 10 or 15 minutes, that one is relating this news, and while he's still speaking, relating the story, then in verse 16, the next one comes up and says, fire of God fell down from heaven, and it burned the sheep and the servants and consumed them, and I alone am left. So now all my sheep are gone. I think the fire of heaven, maybe lightning. I don't know. Some have said God that fire and brimstone was rained down. I don't know exactly. I tend to think about the lightning storm that may have taken out the sheep. But whatever it was, it really doesn't matter. All of that is gone. And then while he was still speaking, in verse 17, they came and said the Chaldeans formed 3 bands. They've come and raided the camels and took them away and killed your servants, and I alone am left. At that point in time, at the end of verse 17, you could mark down there in your Bibles, what's Job's condition at this point in time? He is financially what? Ruined. He's financially ruined. It'd be like you getting up in the morning, because none of us have the money of Job, and we open up our bank accounts and we realize what? It's all gone. It's all gone. The bank's taken our house. You know, everything's been reaped. We have what? We've got nothing. He's financially ruined and financially bankrupt. And all that really fails in comparison to the next trial in verse 18 and 19, because the word comes in that there was a great wind that came across, maybe a tornado, and it hit the 4 corners of the house where all of his kids were together, what? And it killed every one of them. And Job said, I alone am left. And so again, I've got Job's financially ruined. His family's what? Gone. He's childless. Yes, Jeff?
I just had a hard time with verse 16 where it says the fire of God fell.
Yeah, I think the fire of God is probably a reference just to lightning that came, because why it's referred to as fire of God. Satan is the one behind it, but God allowed it to take place. You know, he did on this occasion. You know, he did on this occasion. He was behind controlling some of that. Whether God gave him that power temporarily or not is something that's beyond my pay grade to answer all of that. But at least God allowed him on this occasion, apparently, to control that and to use that. Let me ask you a question. It's one of the questions I had on Job chapter 1. What do you do now? You're in Job's situation. I mean, you wake up. You're in the sunshine. I mean, you're on the mountaintop. Sunshine is what McGuigan calls it. In the rest of the book, at least through chapter 42, he said it's life in the ashes. What do you do, and how do you respond if you're Job? Yeah.
what happens to us is not any less than impactful.
Can be.
So,
Yeah.
I mean, we can look at that and say, what would we do, you know, if we were in Job's position? Well, the fact of the matter is, we've been in Job's position. It may be only one of those things, or two of those things, but, you know, so I think there's a whole lot of folks who've dealt with things, difficulties in life,
Right.
who have proven that they have the faith of Job.
I think that's right. I mean, you know, nobody may lose 10 kids, but losing one kid is just as much trial to them at that point in time as what it is. But, you know, so things get worse, you know, when it's just one trial after another sometimes, though. You know, you think, okay, here's a trial, I can overcome that one, but before that one's over, what? There's another one, and before that one's over, there's another one, and then it sort of compounds and it makes it even more difficult. I think anybody in Job's position, by the way, you know, one thing I think I learned in Job, this is sort of a side note, sometimes the challenge is not the initial shock of the struggle. You know, Job initially, when he loses everything, what's his faith like? It's strong. He doesn't curse God. We'll talk about that. He doesn't blame God for anything. Then chapter 2, at the end of chapter 2, you know what? He still doesn't blame God for anything, for everything. But it's after he has to live in that trial and it begins to become a daily thing that then it becomes a little bit more difficult. If you understand what I'm saying, sometimes it's not the initial shock of the trial that is more difficult. It's after it's over with and you've got to live with the consequences of that become the real difficulty. I think anybody would certainly feel for Job in this circumstance. And Job certainly mourned. He tore his robe, he shaved his head, he fell to the ground, and then he said what? He worshiped. I mean, he worshiped. Where did he turn to in all of this? He turned to God. And he worshiped him. Naked came I from my mother's womb, naked go I hence. The Lord gives and the Lord takes away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. And all this, Job did not sin or charge God with wrong. That is, he didn't blame God for all of that. Now, let me get through this and we'll talk about some practical lessons very quick. Chapter 2, Satan comes in again. Summing up what has happened here, Satan comes into God's presence again. Again, God brings up Job. If you consider my servant Job a blameless and upright man. And in verse 3, he still holds fast to his integrity. In other words, you've taken everything he's got and what? He's still faithful. In fact, listen, this is interesting. I think this is probably God needling Satan a little bit. He said, he still holds fast to his integrity, although you incited me to destroy him without cause. And I say that because that word without cause is exactly the same phrase that is translated for nothing back in chapter 1 and verse 9. In other words, where he said, Job didn't serve you for nothing. God uses that phrase and says, you caused me to attack him for nothing, for no reason. And Satan's response is what? All that a man has, he'll give in exchange for his life. I'm not sure, by the way. From my perspective, maybe I'm wrong about this. From my perspective, I think I could handle the trial of Job 2 better than I could the loss of all my kids. But having said that, Satan's point of perspective is man is self-centered. Man is selfish. And if you attack him what? Personally, then he'll curse you. That's why he has it. You're still protecting him. And God said, okay, you can attack him, but do not what? Do not take his life. And so he attacks his health. And painful boils come upon him from the crown of his head to the sole of his foot. In fact, he's out there scraping himself in ashes with the broken pieces of pottery, if you can imagine, trying to get some relief. It is useless to try to figure out what Job had. Some say elephantitis. Some have said it was leprosy. But you go through the book of Job, and you see everything Job was dealing with, boils and itching, and his appearance is so changed, his friends don't even recognize him. He's got worms and running sores and shortness of breath, and his breath stinks. He said it's repulsive to his wife. He's losing weight. His skin is blackened and peeling. He's got a fever, and all that is lasting for months. And all of that compounded on what? The fact that he's lost everything, and he has no children to rely on. They're all gone. And so Satan really throws everything he has at Job. And Job's wife came to him and said what? Curse God and die. Now, let me say, I think, a couple of things about that before we talk about Job's response back to her. Job's wife's response is not right. I mean, in fact, Job basically says what? You're talking like a foolish woman speaks. I would just say, before we're overly harsh with Job's wife, remember what she's going through. You know, she's lost everything too. She's just planned 10 funerals too. In some ways, it's harder to see people that you love going through suffering than it is what? Going through it yourself. She sees her husband, who was probably once in her eyes what? This strong man who could do anything, and now she looks out and she sees him in the ashes, what? Scratching himself. I'm just simply saying, what she says is not right. Before over the creek, remember, what would you do in Job's wife's shoes? When you're facing that kind of adversity as well among your loved ones. But Job said, you speak as one of the foolish women speak. So we accept good from, should we accept good from the hand of God, not adversity? Yes.
I also think about our father who watched his son.
Yeah.
You talk about hurting you, watching your kids or whatever go through an issue. He watched his son go through that.
Yeah.
And so it's a good parallel there.
Yeah, I can't imagine the difficulty of that, can we? And in all that, Job did not sin with his lips. In all of that, he still didn't blame God. He still maintains faith. But Job, by the way, never loses his faith in the book of Job. Now, are there times his faith wavers? Yeah. Are there times Job says some things he shouldn't have said? Yeah, there are. You ever done that? Yeah. There have been times where your faith wavers in the midst of trial. So that's why he's an example of perseverance. At the end of this chapter, the three friends visit. Bildad, Eliphaz, and Zophar. One thing I just want to say just as our time ends here before we move on is don't look at these men that come as bad men. Okay? I think sometimes we can look in the book of Job and we almost make Eliphaz and Bildad and Zophar and later Elihu all out to be the enemy in the book. And I want to suggest to you that I think these are good men that come. One thing, look at verse 11. They had come and made an appointment to come together and to mourn with him and what? To comfort him. One translation is to show compassion to him. They'd come from some distance. Apparently they'd known Job for some time. And so I think, these are people that are concerned about Job's welfare. They're concerned about his situation. Number two, I would remind you of this, that throughout the book of Job, no matter what friend is speaking, they're concerned about God. They talk about God. They talk about turning to God. Now, their theology is wrong, but they're concerned about God. They want Job to do the right thing. In fact, I think part of the problem with these men, in essence, by the way, is they held to a true principle. They just misapplied the principle. When I say they held to a true principle, the principle they're holding to is you reap what you sow. Is that a biblical principle? You reap what you sow. Now, the problem was they misapplied that principle to the present suffering that one takes in this life and made the conclusion that if bad things are happening to you, then what? It must mean that you're sinning and therefore you need to repent. And so they held to a biblical principle, I think, but they misapplied that principle. But they're not bad men. In fact, I gather from this that they're righteous men who are concerned about God and the things of God. I'd also remind you of this. They're not the ones that start the conversation. It is Job in Job 3 that when the 7 days of mourning are open, Job opens his mouth and said, I wish I'd never even been born. And if I was going to be born, I wish I'd have been born still. I wish I'd have been stillborn. And if I wasn't born stillborn, I wish I could die right now. So Job opens and begins to speak, and then the friends feel compelled what? To answer back, and to some way to come to God's defense. Unfortunately, their defense is not always accurate. And you have to keep in mind, by the way, as we go through this, these are not inspired men speaking. And so everything Job says isn't true. And everything that Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar says isn't true. Everything Elihu said is not true. These are uninspired men. What we have is what? An inspired account of what they said. In fact, the only one you can fully trust in the book of Job and what they say is when God speaks in chapter 30, 38. But there are some valuable lessons to learn. Somebody had their... Okay.
You said
I mean, they had come from some distance to sit there quietly and in the outside and not say anything, just to show their compassion and their concern and their care for Job. All of that shows their love and what good men that they are. Unfortunately, as I've said many times, the best part of their work was done in Job 2:11-13, when they are sitting there silently with Job and seeking to comfort. In fact, not only that, look at verse 12. What did they do? They tore their robe and sprinkled dust on their heads. They're mourning right alongside of Job there. And I can only imagine, by the way, have you ever gone to see somebody you haven't seen in some time? I'm just putting myself in Job's position. I've done that before. Maybe it's somebody, someplace I preached or whatever, and I show up at the building and I can hardly recognize them. They've been sick. They are emaciated. I mean, and you think, what? This is not the person that what? I knew. Maybe even they have to introduce themselves to. That's where Job's friends are. He's not the man that they had known. And now Job is about as low as a man can go. And the question is, how's Job what? How's he going to act? How is he going to respond to that? How are we going to respond in those moments of trial and suffering? Because it's going to come. It may not come all at once like Job, but it's going to come bit by bit, little by little. Sometimes it's going to seem like when it rains, what? It pours. It seems sometimes like that's just... I've known families that were that way. If you know people that it just seemed it was just one trial right after another, and it's in those moments of trial that faith really what? Shines through. One thing is, as we bring this to a close, one thing I learned about patience. Job is an example of patience. What does patience mean? I think sometimes we have the idea that patience means we never voice any complaint. We never say anything negative about the circumstance that we're in. The reality is, throughout the book of Job, you know what Job does? He complains. Patience is not the passive acceptance of everything where we never say, why is this happening to me? I don't understand. Patience is when we keep on keeping on, even when we don't understand. And even sometimes when we voice complaints about things, we just keep on keeping on. And that's what Job does. And that's why he's such a wonderful example for you and for me, is because of that steadfastness and that stick-to-itiveness that he exhibits. We're not going to go verse by verse through all this, because if we do, you're going to find yourself repeating yourself over and over again throughout the book of Job, because basically every speech is going to say exactly the same thing over and over again. So we're going to cover it in sections, but the outline for Job 3 through Job 7 is in the back, and we'll talk about Job's speech, Eliphaz's response to him, and then Job's response back, as well as, and that'll be what we'll talk about.